All right. Today's webinar presenter is Dr. JoNeil Smith-Conley. She is primarily teaches in our health administration program here at CGHS. And thank you everyone for attending the webinar today, and I'll let JoNeil go ahead. Again, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A or the chat, and I will field those for you.
Thank you very much. Greetings, everybody. I hope you're warm wherever you are. I'm actually coming to you from my office at Graduate Mid-Michigan, and there's all sorts of stuff on my desk over there, which looks probably like everybody else's desk. But I'm appreciative to have this opportunity to share some of the work that I have done in the past on bullying in the nursing workplace. I currently am the director of the operating room and the emergency department at Mid-Michigan Gratiot in Alma, Michigan. That I was started here in September, and prior to that I was working at the advisory board company out of Washington, D.C. So I actually was interested in this topic of bullying in the perioperative nursing workplace because of my own history. I think most of us in healthcare have heard the terminology that nurses eat their young and we're not nice to one another, and it's just sort of been this normalized deviance that's occurred. I'm a graduate of a diploma school of nursing from a really long time ago. And I spent the majority of my career in the operating room, early on in my OR career. And I don't know everybody's level of clinical expertise or not, and if this will gross you out, I apologize, but I was actually circulating a case where we were repairing someone's aorta. And I was a new nurse, and the gal that was at the table was my preceptor, and she was working with the surgeon. She'd been there for a long time, and she actually asked for a certain retractor. And I went running around, hysterically looking for this retractor. And I got back after a few minutes and said I couldn't find it, and I just felt terrible. And this nurse turned to the physician and kind of threw me under the bus and said, "Oh, she's new, just go ahead and use this one." Well, I found out after the fact that this nurse who was the chief of that service, knew full well that equipment was out for repair. So she sent me on a wild goose chase to make me look bad in front of the physician, and in essence extended that patient's surgery time and consequently put the patient at risk. That was my first experience. I think all of us understand bullying when we're growing up and all that, but in a professional setting, I found that very disheartening, and it wasn't the last time that happened. I have a video clip, it might take me a minute technologically speaking to get to it, but when we think about healthcare, most of us have seen the TV show Grey's Anatomy about the interns who started San Francisco Grace Hospital, but kind of pay attention to the actual bullying or the way that these individuals were culturalized in the system.
Really? End of the hall.
That's the Nazi?
I thought the Nazi would be a guy.
I thought the Nazi would be the Nazi.
Maybe it's professional jealousy. Maybe she's brilliant and they call her a Nazi because they're jealous. Maybe she's nice.
Let me guess, you're the model.
Hi, I'm Isabel Stevens, but everyone calls me Izzy.
I have 5 rules, memorize them. Rule number 1, don't bother sucking up. I already hate you, that's not gonna change. Trauma protocol, phone list, pagers. Nurses will page you. You answer every page at a run. A run, that's rule number 2. Your first shift starts now and lasts 48 hours. Your interns, grunts, nobodies, bottom of the surgical food chain. You run labs, write orders, work every second night until you drop, and don't complain. On call rooms, attendings hog them, sleep when you can, where you can, which brings me to rule number 3. If I'm sleeping, don't wake me unless your patient is actually dying. Rule number 4, the dying patient better not be dead when I get there. Not only will you have killed someone, you would have woke me for no good reason. We clear? Yeah.
I don't know if you guys lost me or not on that. We sort of missed the end of that conversation. Just go to. So, Sue, can you just let me know that I'm back on track here and you can hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Oh,
and that was hilarious.
Yeah. So there's parts to that video that I think are real important for us in healthcare to understand. Those folks were on their very first day of working at Seattle Grace, and they were bullied their very first day, But think about, the eye rolling, the sighing, oh, so you're the model. But when you think about Bailey's rules, rule number 3, don't call me lest the patient's dying. Rule number 4, the patient better not be dead when I got there because you think I'd killed somebody for no good reason. So I guess the question is, when are they going to call her? And the answer is never. So think about these impacts as it relates to patient care. So I think all of us have a concept of what bullying is and what it looks like, and it is really pervasive in American businesses, and it is really pervasive in the nursing workplace. And I would posit that it's probably it's prevalent in other places in healthcare. And in terms of the research that was done on bullying in nursing, it was basically, for the most part, done on what happened to the bullied nurse. Very few studies were out there that impacted or told us what happened to the patients. Now, again, if you kind of stretch this out, when you think, okay, if the nurse is bullied, chances are he or she is not at her best. If he or she is not at her best, consequently, that would impact patient care. And so I was really driven to this when I was coming up with a topic for my doctoral dissertation. And I knew going in that this is what I was going to study. And we can have the conversation about how my mentor thought it wasn't a good topic and I pushed through and it was a good topic. But there is this urgency about this in terms of bullying in healthcare. The kicker of this is that bullying is, for the most part, hidden from the consumers. If you were to ask a patient, is your nurse bullied? Hopefully they're going to say no, but it's out there. The statistics are 37% of U.S. workers report being bullied. And if we extrapolate that to the population of healthcare workers, that's 5,444,000 healthcare workers who are bullied. I think this next point is really important as we look at what's happening in changing healthcare. I just came from a meeting a little while ago about how we're compressed and we had money taken away and we've got these unattainable targets. And there's a culture that's based on these unattainable targets, which exacerbates bullying. Somebody's got to get to the top. And oftentimes bullying occurs in organizations that have transactional leadership, which was where I was at a little while ago. Don't tell anybody that, but it's like, get this done instead of transformational leadership. And how can we as a team do it? And we also know that bullying leads to compromised work environment. Nobody wants to come in and be treated poorly, degraded, and all of that. It leads to a disengaged workforce. And lastly, worker apathy. So this history of nursing, of bullying, for the most part, bullying is considered an expression of oppressed groups' behavior. Lewin in 1948 did a study by which he identified that oppression, or the mechanisms of oppressed groups, are how they gain freedom. And True and Hamilton in 1967 identified these 5 characteristics. I've only got 4 of them listed here, but the identification with the oppressor, horizontal violence, which if you study the nursing literature, we'll call it self-deprecation and emotional dependence. So these are those characteristics of an oppressed group, and they were then applied to the profession of nursing. And most of that happened following the 1970s and the women's movement, and some people on this call probably weren't even alive in the 1970s, but oppressed group behaviors were attributed to nursing. It was like, this is why nurses behave that way. And 3 mechanisms of that were identified to reinforce bullying. First of all, the education of nurses occurred within the medical model. The nurses were the extension of the physician. They didn't have autonomy. They were, in essence, oppressed. There were rewards to nurses who exhibited the preferred behaviors. The nurses that were very passive. And again, when I think about when I went into nursing in the late 70s, we stood up when the physician walked in the room and we gave our chairs away and all of that. And those were the preferred behaviors. And fast forward to the 1970s and the women's movement, those things started to change. And there was appeasement of those that were oppressed. So what happened is over the years is that this application of the oppression theory towards nursing saying, okay, we figured out what caused it, didn't result in any decline in behaviors. The bullying behavior still continued. There wasn't anything that was happening. There was no theories. There was nothing out there that said, they just said, oh, nurses are oppressed and this is why they eat their young. This is why they behave that way. Well, because the behaviors hadn't changed, it really identified that there should be some other kind of explanation that was necessary. Another real important thing in my learning, and one of the things I think all of us that are in the healthcare field recognize, that in 2008, the Joint Commission actually issued a sentinel event alert, meaning this is important, this is serious. And this was in 2008. And this was, actually the line in the sand, or they called it disruptive behavior, which is the same as bullying. But disruptive behavior, and I'm going to just go ahead and read this, is conduct by a health professional that intimidates others in an organization to the extent that quality and safety are compromised. So when you think about it, and again, there's a lot of studies, and when I was doing my research, I actually found a study of pharmacists, that the pharmacists did not call the physicians to clarify orders because of the intimidation factor. So there was a lot of information out there, but not so much as it related to the patient care. So let's look at some of these behaviors. Some of them, again, are overt. The verbal outbreaks, the physical threats. And again, people go, oh, how can that be physical threats? But I was a director of an operating room where a surgeon actually stabbed an OR tech in the hand because she was chomping on her gum. Now, that guy was a little bit off the beam, but again, there are physical threats. There are things. But what is harder to identify are those passive behaviors. The physician who won't answer his pages, who's condescending, who's uncooperative with the routine activities. And again, these are the intonation, the impatience. And one of the things that was also part of this Sentinel alert was that organizations that don't address these issues are complicit and are actually held accountable. So the Joint Commission in 2008 said, wait, this is serious enough. And this was based on the work of Rosenberg, which you'll see I referenced a little bit later. So the purpose of my study was actually to utilize this Marie Hutchinson. She's a researcher out of Australia who was absolutely amazing when I reached out to her for help. Again, people have written to me post-work and said, can we use your stuff? And I will do it. But she was a continent away and did everything she could to help me. And she had done a lot of bullying work in Australia, but Hutchinson, Jackson, Wilkes, and Vicker identified this explanatory model of bullying in the nursing workplace. And it was validated for an Australian audience, so I wanted to see how applicable it was for an American audience. So that was one piece of it. And I also wanted to look at the negative effect on what's called the surgical never events. And those were not originally measured by Hutchinson, but the 5 surgical never events, surgery on the wrong patient, wrong site, wrong procedure, retained surgical instrument, and a death of a healthy patient. So I wanted to see, can we take this explanatory tool regarding bullying and identify, is there some kind of correlation between these bullying factors and patient outcomes? So this, again, using the oppression theory framework and also Hutchinson's model, and her 3 pieces, and I'll show you a depiction of that in just a second, were organizational, and she called them antecedents, but she allowed me to call them predictors, the actual bullying acts, and then the consequences of bullying. And so this is how she actually put her model together. If you go to the far left, the organizational antecedents, meaning organizational tolerance and reward toward bullying. The second one were those informal alliances. And the third part was the misuse of authority. This is what she considered her predictors. The middle section were the bullying acts. And I won't spend a whole lot of time because I think most people understand that. But she actually broke it into 3 categories: personal attacks, attacks on reputation and competence, and attacks to work task, meaning giving somebody an assignment that was just they were unable to be successful. And then the consequences of bullying, this normalization of bullying, distress and avoidance of work, health effects, and then interruption in the career. So we actually took this model. She has what's called the WBI, the workplace bullying inventory, and created subscales for each of these 3 categories. And so, again, taking the first one, the bullying acts, the personal attacks, reputation. And again, part of what it was is there's no really universal definition of bullying. They were all over the board. So I ended up taking Hutchinson's definition, knowing that it could be overt or it could be covert. I worked in places where nurses would hide pieces of equipment or they share information. There were things that were going on. Oftentimes the bullying acts are repetitive, resulting from an imbalance in power. Underline, they are intended to harm the target. They're intended to make the person less effective. And we can have some conversation and debate about whether these are conscious or unconscious, but this is sort of the way we looked at this. Farrell in 1997, I'll think about that, 1997, called this kind of bullying professional terrorism. I thought that was an interesting kind of terminology. But again, threats to personal status, name-calling, insults, ridicule, gossiping, not teaching information, the undermining activities, withholding information, impossible assignments, scapegoating, and sabotage. I actually shared this with my husband, who's not in healthcare. He said, these things cannot possibly go on. Remember me saying it was hidden from the general population, but they do go on. And interestingly enough, I was just in a grievance hearing yesterday. I'm going to tell a little bit about my personal life and work life, is that I had a nurse call another nurse a fat ass. Okay, that's bullying. But I tell you what, it was something else to get that discipline and to get her understanding. And, again, that's a toxic work environment. So the bullying acts were pretty easily defined. The consequences of bullying, again, that normalization of bullying in work teams, where it just has become, so-and-so, oh, that's just the way they are. Oh, so-and-so's on, moon is in Aquarius, are going to be in a bad mood, all of that sort of stuff. And we accept people's behavior. And when I was teaching these classes at the advisory board, I always said, if you work with somebody whose middle name is but, meaning they're really good to work with, but, they're really good nurse, but, they're really good physician, but they're awful, they're mean, they're hateful, something's wrong with that picture. We also know that there are people who actually call in sick. They don't want to come to work. They look at the schedule and go, oh, that one's working, I don't want to be there. We also know the health effects. And it can go from, indigestion, all of that, all the way up to suicide. I think when we look at the spectrum, and then there are people who actually come out of the workforce because of a bully. So again, physical stress, headaches, anxiety, decreased self-esteem, PTSD, inability to make sound decisions. Now let's stop on that one for a second. If you have a nurse or physician or anybody in the healthcare profession who needs to make a decision about your health care, don't you want that to be a sound decision instead of them not being able to, because they're afraid of what the bully's going to do? And I can tell you a whole nother story about some bullying physicians in our IR department that caused all sorts of things where people were afraid in this sense of powerlessness. But then that's to the individual. Look at the consequences to the organization. People quit, decreased patient outcomes, decreased productivity, increased errors, decreased morale. So again, we know what bullying looks like. For the most part, this is not new information, this consequences. But what I thought was interesting was Hutchinson's model actually talked about the fact that you can predict bullying in your organizations. If these pieces are in place, informal organizational alliances, and in our world we would call them cliques, or we would call them little groups who, get things done, organizational tolerance and reward of bullies. And this is another interesting piece where people who are a bully oftentimes are rewarded because they're able to get things done. They get things done at the expense of other people. And then this misuse of legitimate authority and processes. Now, it was interesting, in Hutchinson's original inventory, there was one of the questions that said, do you have mates in high places? And I'm thinking, I don't think she's talking about a marriage partner. So we were able to change some of the Australian terminology to friends in places of authority. So having predictors of bullying, at the end of the day, and I'm jumping ahead in my presentation, but this is where we should be functioning. We should be focusing. Let's fix it before it even starts. So the research questions, again, to what extent do the organizational predictors of bullying and bullying acts, are they related to one another? to what degree are the organizational predictors and the consequences related, to what degrees are the bullying acts and the consequences, all this correlation piece. But where my heart was fallen was question number 4. Is there a relationship between bullying in the perioperative nursing workplace and potential negative effects of patient outcome in the surgical never events, in terms of surgical never events? I knew I needed to do all that other stuff just to make sure that we were on the right track. But again, where my meat and potatoes were right there on question number 4. So again, the hypotheses, in terms of the level of exposure being correlated to bullying acts, the level of exposure being related to consequences, the level of exposure being related to the bullying acts and all that. The hypotheses were all a correlational. But again, the 4th one, again, was where my heart was. And again, the null hypothesis, there's no relationship between bullying in the perioperative nursing workplace and the potential negative impacts. Again, jumping ahead, there is a correlation, but a relationship. So again, this was a quantitative correlational study with a focus on the relationship between bullying and the patient outcomes. The independent variable was the bullying in the perioperative nursing workplace as measured by the workplace bullying inventory. And again, we made subsets for each of those 3 categories, predictors, acts, and consequences. And the dependent variable was the perioperative nurse's perception of the impact on bullying. Now, again, there was some conversation about the nurse's perception, but it was impossible to go back and to retrospectively look at all the never events. So this was our proxy where that was concerned. So how was I going to get to all these nurses? We used a link to the Association of Perioperative Nurses, registered nurses, used SurveyMonkey. I used every possible internet link I could find. I put information out on all the practice councils for the AORN. Again, there was informed consent, there was demographics, there was the bullying inventory, and then there was additional questions about the impact on bullying on patient outcomes. What was interesting, again, we needed to look at the reliability, the frequency, the descriptive, the correlation, and then the regression analysis on research question number 4. So my population, again, were registered nurses employed in med-surg hospitals. The target population, again, was perioperative nurses practicing in the United States, and the participants being 18 years or older. So my sample was drawn from approximately 116,000 perioperative nurses in the United States, with a sample size for confidence interval was 393 samples. So I put my survey out, posted it on all sorts of sites, and everybody said, "Oh, Jonelle, you're never going to get that many. It's going to take forever." In one day, well, it was actually 36 hours, I had 393. And within 3 days, I had almost 1,100 responses. So this was a hot topic with the nurses. I mean, I didn't have to wait. These surveys were returned. And what was interesting is not only the surveys, but oh my goodness, I had nurses just writing to me with their stories and what had happened to them and leaving the profession. And it was gut-wrenching to get these responses from the nurses. So again, they ended up with 1,267 surveys. So again, we did in hypothesis number 1, there was a positive correlation between the exposure of organizational predictors and exposure to bullying acts. Again, if bullying acts are present within the organization, this increases the influence of organizational predictors. So again, that was the correlation there. There was a negative correlation between the level of exposure to predictors of bullying and the consequences. As the levels of exposure, the predictors decrease, the consequences of the perioperative nursing workplace increase. And this was really unexpected. But we kind of thought that one through and thinking, okay, they just get numb to it, and they're not willing to report it. And so there's some other diving deeper into this negative correlation between the exposure of the acts and the consequences. And this means as they just get used to it, it just becomes the norm in their workplace. Because I mentioned before, hypothesis 4 was my hot spot, and I really wanted to find out did the nurses really believe if bullying impacted their ability to deliver patient care and on these particular items, doing surgery on the wrong patient, surgery on the wrong site, the wrong procedure, retained instruments, and the death of a healthy patient. And again, there was a significant relationship to all of these. So who were the bullies and where did they fall out on this? Again, I thought this was interesting. And this didn't surprise me that the surgeon came out as the highest bully. Now, again, that's the nurse in me. Any physicians on the line, please forgive me. What was interesting when you added these up, when you added bullied by a colleague, bullied by your supervisor, and bullied by an allied health staff member, it was higher than bullied by the physician. But nobody was spared. Nobody was spared in this. So again, it's out there. And so I kind of gave the physicians a pass on this one because I was looking at the nurse-to-nurse bullying, but they're equally culpable where this is concerned. So this was where my heart lie in terms of the impact of the bullying on the surgical never events. Now, if we stop back for just a minute and we take our researcher's hat off to our patient hat, if this happens only once, it's one too many times. If bullying impacts the death of a patient one time, and again, this was the nurses, the significance was small, but it was still there in their responses. It was interesting about what came out the highest was the retained surgical instruments. Now, if there are any OR nurses on the line, they know that when you're counting, it's like, hurry, 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 get it done, get it done, get it done. That came out at the one that was the highest. But the bottom line is, from our patient hat, it doesn't matter. One time is one time too many if bullying impacts the death of the patient. So the result of the stepwise regression analysis indicated that the 2 of the 3 subscales, which were organizational predictors and consequences, were statistically related to all 5 surgical never events. That was what I believed going in. And again, it was a hard road to get to this place, but I wanted to make sure that was evident. So the significance of this study in terms of leadership, it sounds simple, but fix the culture. Fix it before it happens. Understand that the culture is leadership driven. And if we can come up with an evidence-based platform to justify the funding for preventative strategies, the bottom line is the bully's always going to be the bully. But we in leadership have to fix the culture so that is mitigated to the most. We need to assess in terms of nursing the negative impact of bullying upon the industry. And we need to have nurses be able to have their voice to identify those negative impacts of their actions. So again, if this bullying isn't controlled, we have a serious problem with the harmonious relationships. Fast forward, I can change the names and the faces in this particular instance, but I had a surgeon, you know where I'm telling you about, who refused to talk to the scrub tech because the scrub tech was mean to his wife's best friend. Now that sounds silly. It sounds childish. These are trained professionals. So finally, I had to pull him into my office and say, this ain't going to happen. You have to talk to the people you're doing surgery with. That was my leadership moment. Again, we had leadership have to be willing to take the hard line on that. When nurses don't have alliances, when they don't have support from the organization, they're more prone to the consequences of bullying. And nurses simply get used to it. And to me, that's one of the saddest things that are there. It just happens, they receive it, it becomes less hurtful, they become disengaged, patient or staff engagement declines, there's a lot of things. Again, one of the other explanations of this could be the age and the seniority of the sample. Bullying should be eliminated, we know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But again, the support of this hypothesis should get the attention of healthcare leaders. Nurses believe that bullying impacts surgery on the wrong patient, wrong procedure, wrong site, leaving something inside of a patient and the death. None of those things should ever happen. That's why we call them surgical never events. So some of the recommendations, again, from my original study, was that it's unacceptable to commit mistakes and bullying should be stopped. Bullying affiliation should be eliminated in nursing organizations. And the study probably should be conducted on all of the healthcare never events, not just the surgical never events. What was difficult is what do you do about it? And I think this is an interesting, again, this was from 214. What do we do at bullying in the nursing workplace? What suggestions to prevent? Being fair, establishing empathy, being respectful, eliminating or establishing rules, providing training, taking necessary measures. 77 of these deal what to do about it. It is a difficult nut to crack, and I don't think anybody on this call would doubt that. I do want to just stop for a second to see if there's any questions, Sue, that I want to address now, because I wanted to do just a tiny little bit of some of the work from the advisory board, if there's any questions for right now.
As of right now, I've got nothing.
Okay, then. All right, then. So let me just give you a little bit of the work that, I mentioned I had been at the advisory board beforehand, and what the model that we identified in terms of addressing this, which is unrelated to my exact study, but I think it's interesting in that, how do we package, what kind of a model? Is there some way of looking at this that makes it something we can look at? Again, the Joint Commission requires that we have a code of conduct and we have a process for managing disruptive behavior or bullying. But is everybody enforcing it? Are there people in leadership who avoid dealing with the behavior? I'm going to say yes, there are. It's difficult. That one particular surgeon, I had to take that right up to the Vice President of Medical Affairs to have him address that with me. Is there authority figures that are enabling it, and are other staff members perpetuating this behavior? So the model that we identified at the advisory board, and this is advisory.com if anybody wants to have access to this, there are bystanders in organizations and healthcare organizations who see this happening and do nothing about it. Those are the bystanders. I think the actor is pretty well identified. We know who that is. In that video clip I showed you from Grey's Anatomy, pretty much Dr. Bailey was the actor. She was the bully. But so were some of the others. If you notice, oh yeah, you're the model. So we know that actor, and oftentimes we think we can change the actor and it's going to fix everything. Are there either enabling policies, procedures, or people in the organization? And are other people preserving that behavior by collaborating? A question, how did those people know on day one that Dr. Bailey's nickname was the Nazi? Somebody told them before they got there. So that is sort of like handed down from generation to generation. So some pieces of this model, and I'll just share it with you again, it's just for thought. Usually the bullies have a history of this. It's not the first time that they've done it. They usually behave this way often. We usually can pick out who that is, and the actor is deliberately disruptive because they get something out of the behavior. Again, in healthcare, if somebody is mean and nasty and they go, oh, just keep them quiet, we'll do all their work, we'll do everything for them. We know the actors, and we sort of, we don't hold them accountable. Bystanders, people who see it and go, oof, glad that person doesn't work for me. Oof, I don't want to have to deal with that. Not my job. Or the other piece of it is that most people in healthcare have this aversion to conflict. A lot of times. Sue, did you have a question?
Yep, I do have a couple here.
Okay.
Somebody says, this is an anonymous, as aggression is a learned behavior, do you believe that bullying is also a learned behavior that has become part of the culture of organizations which have promoted it? What do you think could help change this culture without disrupting the normal flow of operations?
Whoever has the answer to that will be a gazillionaire. Yes, it's learned behavior. Yes, leaders have to address it. You know what? It takes courage. It takes courage to do that. And a lot of healthcare leaders, it's tough. If we could fix it, it would be done by now. But you have to be willing to walk through that really uncomfortable space to do it. And it is equally as disruptive. But organizations can no longer afford to keep a disruptor. They can't afford a surgeon who won't talk to their scrub tech. They have to be willing to hold everybody accountable and say, you know what, if you can't follow our code of conduct, you can't work here. Do I have the techniques and strategies? I wish I did, because I'd be a millionaire. Anything else, Sue?
Yep, there's one more. Kathleen Matheson says, there's been a lot of research on the culture of medical residency, particularly with regard to duty hours and resulting restrictions by ACGME. Why do you think that these cultural issues in nursing have been more difficult or slow to be addressed? They're giving you some good ones, aren't they?
They are. And I don't want to go into a whole gender thing, but I do think there are some gender issues involved in it. There are some, 90% of nurses are women. The majority of physicians are men. I think there is this inequity of power that is being slowly but surely eliminated. But nursing, again, go back to the women's movement of the 70s and the handmaidens and the educational process of nurses. I think it's wide, it's very well spread, and we just sort of accept it. Oh, nurses eat their young. Oh, I made it through orientation. You can make it through orientation too. But I think when we tie that into the patient outcomes, it has more teeth. And the nursing leaders that I work with are are very willing to do it, but they haven't been trained to do that. You got to remember too, in nursing, many nurses, and oftentimes in healthcare, were really good clinicians. I was the best OR nurse you ever saw. And somebody said, oh my God, you're so good, you should be the boss. I was ill prepared to be the boss. So I think some of that has happened. I think that's one explanation. There may be others. Shall I move on?
I've got one more.
Okay.
It says, our accountability and transparency division is the biggest bully. How would you bring this up to the CEO, and how would you go about catching them in the act?
Say that one more time.
Our accountability and transparency division, so I'm assuming this is where this person works, is the biggest bully. How would you bring this up to the CEO, and how would you go about catching them in the act? And there's a follow-up question to that as well, but I'll let you do the first one first.
Well, I've worked at places where the middle manager is the bully and it has to get up to the CEO. First of all, you have to document objectively, not emotionally. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you a model about having the conversation about describing the behavior. This is where you separate the who from the do. And when I have conversations with the bully, it's not about you, but this behavior is unacceptable. And when we talk about catching him in the act, oftentimes our emotions get involved, and we have this victim mentality. And I'm going to tell you to step out of that, and I'm going to tell you to be very black and white. And I'm also going to tell you to track the consequences of that. We couldn't get the work done. We didn't meet our deadlines. We were unable to do this. It cost the organization this much money. These are the behaviors that we witnessed. Don't say, oh, so-and-so was rude. No, these are the exact words that came out of their mouth. My suggestion is you've got to document it as clearly and as unemotionally as possible. And then you take that. And I would say, again, you have to document, and you have to push it up the chain. And a couple of reasons why you have to do that, because pushing it up the chain allows you, and it eliminates plausible deniability. If you push it up the chain and they say, well, I never knew that was, here's my emails to you that I did return receipt and you signed for them. So that document, this is not an easy thing. And people go, oh, you mean you want me to document the eye rolling? Well, yeah, we documented them calling her a fat ass. Absolutely. Use the exact situation unemotionally as possible. That was one of my recommendations.
Okay, and one more question. Is there any research on the impact of bullying on disability and administering of disability benefits in healthcare organizations?
There might be, but I don't know. That was an easy question because I don't know the answer to that.
Well, and the Q&A window is now completely answered. So,
okay,
and
let me just walk real quickly through these others, and hopefully they're a little bit helpful, and then we can finish up in just a couple minutes. So bystanders, again, aversion to conflict. Enabling behaviors. This goes back to the conversation we just had. Many times there'll be a bully in the organization, and you go to look in their file, and there's not a gosh darn thing there. So document. A lot of times organizations turn the other cheek, don't look at it. Or a lot of times people that are bullied do not report it. And that was another one of the findings in the study, was that people don't report it for fear of retribution. Oh my God, if I say something, my life is going to be just absolute hell. So make sure, again, there has to be this safe culture and without fear of retribution in order for people to come forward. A lot of times people will collaborate amongst the bully, or the bully gets to be this urban legend. I've worked at places where, oh my God, guess what happened with so-and-so, and this disruption and negative stories and gossiping. Whether you want to admit it or not, that gossiping is a form of bullying because stories get told and there's no way of addressing the person. A lot of times people collaborate because they're doing the same thing, those people in leadership. And the last thing we talked about was that issue of normalization. This was the conversation, or just the model that we used, and I use it all the time when addressing the bullies, is to describe the behavior objectively. Take the emotion out of it. This is what you said, and don't use descriptive words. Don't where you were condescending. Use the exact words. Use the exact scenario. The next thing that's really important, and this goes back to the person who had some bullying in her own organization, what's the code of conduct? Have that code of conduct right there when you're having the conversation. If you're the leader having the conversation with the bully, pull out the code of conduct. This is what everybody is expected to behave. When you, and I've told bullies before, you can be in a bad mood the minute you cross that threshold, swipe that badge, you are now the face of this organization, and you don't get to act that way. This is unacceptable behavior. And the last part that most of us as leaders are really, really bad at are the consequences to the bully if the behavior continues. Now, every last one of us on this call knows somebody who works for an organization who's just not a good employee and should probably be released to the community, but nobody wants to go through the aggravation. So again, the consequences to the bully are you're going to be disciplined, your behavior has to change, you're going to have privileges removed from you. If this behavior continues, these are the things that are going to happen. And then you got to stick to your guns where that's concerned. So that's one of those models I think that everybody could take, because I didn't want to have this conversation and not give you some tools where that was concerned. So what happens is organizations need leaders, not bystanders. Not people are just going to say, oh, somebody else. We have to have people who are exemplars, who are willing to model good behavior, who understand conflict resolution, who are willing to do what needs to be done to make this not happen. We need people who are supporters, not enablers. When I went to my boss and said, I'm going to discipline so-and-so for what, absolutely, here's what you need to do. I'm going to support you. I'm not going to enable you, which was different than what had been happening here before. When I took over this department, it was very toxic, and we had to do some house cleaning, but I needed my boss to support me where that was concerned. And the last one is we want team members, not people who are going to collaborate with that. So that's, again, a model where that's concerned. So any other questions or thoughts or comments? I know I got done a little bit faster than necessary, but go ahead, Sue.
Michelle Kamali asks, I was wondering what you know about bullying in nursing education, specifically bullying of the student by the educator. I'm interested in exploring the impact of the educator and the impact this has on student progress. This is the basis for my dissertation.
Call me. No, there's research out there. Again, it's not off the top of my head can I think about it, but it is very well documented, and I can give you some personal examples as well. But that is very prevalent. I mean, I can remember going back to my own nursing education that there was instructors who were bullies. So I am more than willing to help you with that, and give me a call.
Okay. I know that some of you expressed in the chat that it was difficult to see some of Dr. Conley's slides. I will get her slide deck from her, and I made a list of everybody who's in the participants list, and I will email her slide deck to you so that you will have it.
Yep.
And I'm getting some thank yous.
You're welcome.
Very interesting. Somebody says, how long did it take for you to plan and conduct this research project for your dissertation?
Oh,
this
much
was an
longer.
Excellent project. Thank you.
Much longer than I thought. It ended up being about 5 years, but I went through 3 committee chairs because my first committee chair thought it wasn't an important topic. My second one, there's other issues. By the time I got to my third committee chair, everything went fine, and I was happy, and I did not have to jump off the Washington Monument. I did have a Dorito overdose and had to be hospitalized almost for that, but it was about 5 years.
Wow. Someone else, Ken, asks, what would be a good follow-up to your study?
I would think to work on to really delve into the organizational predictors and to, first of all, quantify them. What do they look like? Do they happen at different levels of the organization? And kind of follow that through. I think we all know what bullying looks like. We know what the consequences are. I really believe focusing on that predictors would be the place to go.
Great. You're so funny when you talk with your hands.
I can't help it. I can't help it. Anyhow, Sue, you will have my contact information, I'm sure, too, if anybody wants to reach out.
Yes, I will include that with your slide decks.
And I will send those to you. Now, that video clip, you kind of have to, it might be out on YouTube. I think I got it off of YouTube. So it's an example of bullying.
And it's everywhere.
Yep. All right. Well, Godspeed, everybody. Be safe. Stay warm.
Thank you very much, Joniel.
All right. Take care.